My interest in this unit comes from trying to better understand contemporary education policy practices and how they relate to changes in global knowledge co-construction, so as I can work out what I might do as a policy actor. So my interest in this unit begins with a consideration of the overarching concept of education policy practices. Education policy is usually thought of as being produced by national, state, or perhaps local government, and for implementation through the practices of educators, albeit mediated by their varying types of institutions. However, I'm interested in education policy practices. Education policy practices sees all elements of the policy cycle. Education policy practices include the local global production and circulation of knowledge, the inclusion and exclusion of ideas as part of the agenda setting work, the policy text production and transmission, implementation and enactment of policy, the contingent and uneven uptake of policy ideas, evaluation and public and private debates at every stage of the policy cycle. Questions for you to think about and to explore further in your discussions and perhaps your assignments include: what factors do you see operating in education policy practices that concern you? Where in your life's work do or might you insert yourself into these education policy practices? How might the global co-construction of knowledge provide you with a resource portfolio for inserting yourself into these education policy practices? Thus, the overarching concept of education policy practices refers to matters of practice where policy is remade as power works in and through each rearticulation and divergence that gives policy its inherent impermanence. Education policy practices are inherently complicated, provisional, multifaceted, and wobbly. Thus, in considering education policy practices, it's important to be attentive to the complexities of power differentials, the heterogeneity within and between contexts and fields of policy production, and the interconnectedness of education policies with other policies and non-policy practices. Knowledge defines what is and is not thinkable, doable in terms of education policy practice. The knowledge used in education policy practices does not necessarily originate in or get implemented in local practices, although it may. Education policy practices are increasingly globalized, with the local global circulation of knowledge and associated values from a potentially diverse array of knowledge-producing places and people informing and transforming national, state and local policies. Questions for you to think about and/or to explore further in your discussions and your assignments include the concept of education policy practices inviting us to think relationally, to undertake a relational analysis and to pose questions about the differential power relations and dynamics, entanglements involved. For example, in what sense does global knowledge inform local education policy practices? What sources of global knowledge are included and what are excluded, ignored, or neglected in local education policy practices? What are the divergences produced through the remaking or recreation at every stage of the education policy practices? How do the embedded power relations in each part of the education policy practice cycle produce possibilities and constraints on valued and valuable changes?